Another question asked here, pastor, apologist, elder. Differences in the gospel accounts lend credibility to the reliability of the gospels. How many times have you heard this? You know how there's differences in, let's say, the birth narrative or the tomb narrative in different gospels. And Christian pastors or apologists will say, well, that lends credibility to the reliability of the gospels. I get that often. So let's listen to J. Warner Wallace again on that.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
Okay, so he's saying that, he's a detective, and he says witnesses never, ever agree. Let me play that again.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
Never, ever agree, except for the times when these supposed witnesses quote each other word for word. This shows that even if you're a Christian who said these are four independent gospel accounts, you have to admit, no, at least partially they're not. Whoever wrote Luke had the book of Mark open and copied word for word.
Because if you've ever worked with witnesses, you know one rule of witnesses. They never, ever agree. Ever. It could happen 5 minutes ago.
And when they don't agree in a big, big way. So here is the tomb narrative according to Mark 16. And by the time you get to John, that same tomb narrative explodes to that. It goes from this to that. And so if you look at all the red text, that's the earliest gospel, according to most scholars, in red. And by the time you get to John, these eyewitness accounts, or these accounts compiled by eyewitnesses, or however you want to put it, explodes. And I realize that Christians have solutions. They have harmonizations to make everything fit. But at some point, I think the Christian has to be reasonable and say, I'm always going with the bigger number. I'm always having to expand it. I'm always going to have to say, well, just because he didn't say it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And you constantly have to build upon the narrative from that to that. And at some point, the weight of that idea that you just constantly have to accept and build onto it takes its toll.
So he is addressing this idea of my clicker ain't working. Why is my clicker working? Differences in the gospel accounts. Now you saw what he said from J. Warner Wallace. Eyewitnesses never, ever agree. Right? Supposedly, except for whenever they do agree. As we'll get to that in a second. So he's saying that, or what J. Warner Wallace was saying, is that there's these differences, right? And whenever you have witnesses together, they're not going to agree on everything. If you actually listen, and dig into what he says whenever he talks about witnesses. Now here's a guy who, his kind of life study, he is an expert in eyewitness testimony analysis. And he says that if the witnesses all agree, that's a red flag that something's going on. That you're actually not going to have them agree. And so he's saying that these differences are the sorts of things that we would expect to find. It was one of the biggest things for J. Warner Wallace whenever he was examining the Gospels, that he saw these differences and he said, wow, wait a minute. This is exactly how I would expect eyewitness testimony to look. That this is what reliable eyewitness testimony looks like. Now, Doug mentions that there's these places where they do agree, right? And he lists a few: Matthew 8:20, Luke 9:58, Mark 14, Matthew 26, Luke 20, and Mark 12. And these are places where they are word for word identical. And so he's saying, oh, well, you say there's these differences, but there's all these places where they agree. And so therefore, the claim is that it's not actually different accounts, but instead it's just all these copies of the same account. He says that Luke had the Gospel of Mark open and copied word for word. And that might actually be the case. And Luke is not shy about admitting that. In the first chapter of Luke, he flat out says that he has taken it upon himself to compile an account from other sources, from what's been handed down to us. So it's perfectly understandable that he would be referring to Mark. Hey, there's already a gospel out there that was written by Mark, a disciple of Peter. So yeah, he's going to go and get that and use it as a source. That does nothing to kind of discount anything of Luke that might be original that was not in Mark. And actually we see quite a bit of that. But just to kind of point out this idea of witnesses and details. I remember one day, I forget what class it was, I think it was philosophy, and just to prove a point, before class had started, it's a few minutes before class, everyone's kind of milling around and talking, and this guy wanders in, looks like any other student, had a backpack on, walked up, talked to the professor for a few seconds, and then walked out. And then about halfway through the lesson, he stopped and he said, "Did anybody notice that kid that came up and talked to me before class?" And most everybody was like, "Oh, yeah, I remember seeing that." And he asked, "What color shirt did he have on?" "Oh, it was blue." "No, it was green." "No, it was brown." "What color hair did he have?" "Oh, it was black hair." "No, it was brown hair." "Was it curly? Was it straight? Was he wearing glasses?" And there was not agreement between the class. And it just happened like 10 minutes ago. And here you have 20, 30 students who watched it happen, and we can't agree on what color that guy's shirt was. Because this is what eyewitnesses happen. It gets processed, it gets filed away, and kind of your mind fills in the blanks of things you can't quite remember. But we all could agree on the fact that a few minutes before class, this kid walked in, stopped, talked to the professor, and then walked out. Now, we couldn't remember what exact color was his hair, what color was his shirt, was he wearing jeans or khakis? And so those are the kind of details that he says you expect eyewitnesses to not agree on these things. And that's what you see in the Gospels. And so the question that's being offered about whether or not this is eyewitness testimony, whether or not these differences actually lend credibility, well, the question's already been answered. The presenter of this video kind of shot himself in the foot because he played a clip of an expert in eyewitness testimony analysis saying that this is what you expect from eyewitnesses, and this actually lends credibility to it. So he actually kind of proved himself wrong with the clip that he himself chose to play. And so are these really independent accounts? Okay, so he not only just kind of disproved himself by playing the J. Warner Wallace clip, now he's going to go into trying to make his case even more. He says, are these really independent accounts where there appears to be copying going on? Yes. There may be similarities. There may be places where they flat out copied one another. I'm sure it happened. But there's also plenty of places where they contain unique and independent material. There are things that, for instance, in Matthew, you have a story of Jesus healing 2 blind guys. You have a mute demoniac. You have the parable of the lost sheep. None of that occurs in the other Gospels. In Luke, you have James and John. Remember, they want to call down fire on a village. They're passing through, and the village says, no, don't stop here. Just keep going. And they tell Jesus, hey, you want us to call down fire on the village? That only appears in the story, in the account of Luke. The sending of the 72, a few weeks ago, we talked about that on Sunday morning, only appears in Luke's account. The parable of the Good Samaritan only appears in Luke's account. In John, the water into wine, the woman at the well, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, only appears in John. So yeah, there's things that they have in common. There's things that they probably even copied from one another. But they each also have independent individual information that the other 3 do not have. They are independent accounts. Even if they shared some information, overall, their sources are independent. And so the real fun one is this tomb narrative. And if you look at one of those pieces of papers I gave you, it has the full color thing that he was showing there. So this idea, and it's kind of common, there's this idea out there that the Gospels are, they evolve, they progress. That Mark wrote first, and then Matthew copied from Mark and added some stuff, and then Luke copied from Matthew and added some stuff. And by the time you get to John, it's a whole different story with all kinds of ideas. They'll say things like, well, back in Mark, the idea of Jesus being God was really kind of, not a lot of it. Whereas by the time you get to John, it's just all about, he was the Word become flesh, and just all this about Jesus being God. And so they say, well, that's an evolution of the legend over time through the Gospels. And that's what he's pointing at. And he says, hey, look, here's this color-coded thing. The ones in red, well, that's what Mark wrote. So it's just a few things, just a little bit. And then in Matthew, it gets a little bit more. And then in Luke, it gets a little bit more. And by the time you get to John, you have this whole big, more developed story that supposedly evolved over time. Well, what's funny about that, okay, is this view, this progression, supposedly, doesn't really stand up when you look at other passages. For instance, if you were to look at the story of Barabbas, the order changes. If you're going based on who gives minimal data and this idea that the story is evolving into the big produced, one, well, then you'd be starting with John. So according to the tomb narrative, they say John is the last one, but according to Barabbas, John offers the slightest bit of material. And then you'd go through Mark and Luke, and Matthew has the biggest, most developed story account of Barabbas. If you look at Jesus and his conversation with Pilate, you get a different order also. And so, whereas Luke has just a short conversation, and if you're only reading Luke, you kind of wonder, what are they talking about? Because there's details that are left out. And then Matthew has more, Mark has more, and John has this whole big exchange back and forth, talking to Jesus, out to the Pharisees, coming back to Jesus, and that isn't in the other three. And so you can actually rearrange the order of the Gospels depending on what passage you're looking at. Right? And so this idea that you develop, that the story developed over time, you can pick any story and rearrange the order that they supposedly developed. And so this whole idea of a progressive or evolving story through the Gospels just does not hold weight. Okay, so he talks about these, I'm trying to think how he worded it. Like these problems, you're constantly having to try to come up with answers and make reasons why things fit. And he says, this is burdensome. The Christian, if you're reasonable, that you have to recognize this is burdensome. Well, it's really not burdensome. I would say, trying not to be too cheeky about it, is that what's burdensome is dealing with these superficial, made-up challenges from critics who seem to be just looking for something. That gets a little burdensome. Right? Is it unreasonable? No, it's not unreasonable. It's actually perfectly reasonable to think that there are differences in the Gospels and that these differences lend credibility to it being eyewitnesses. And should this cause doubt? And I think you know where my answer is on that. No, this is nothing. These differences in the Gospels is absolutely nothing that should cause any kind of anxiety or doubt or tension in a believer. So, kind of ran through that, but any thoughts or questions on that idea of these differences in the Bible? It's one thing I like, and I think they're actually fun. Just like on Sunday mornings, as we're preaching through the Gospels, when I come across differences, oh, hey, let's look at these differences and explain what they mean, see why they're different. And 9 times out of 10, they're just different details of the story, And so